And the topics to cover are knowing your vendors, what payments are reportable, your Form W-9, Form 1099 NEC, the Form 1099 miscellaneous, and how can we improve the process that we go through at year end for 1099s. So on knowing your vendors, an important thing to do is review your vendor list throughout the year. Investigating any payments to unknown vendors. If there's a vendor on your list and you don't know who that is, finding out what was paid to them. If you have a lot of inactive vendors on your list, you might want to remove those. And if you find any duplicate vendors, sometimes if you're entering vendors, you'll have the word "the" on one vendor name, and then someone comes along and keys it in again without "the," and so it's not matching up. And that will affect your 1099s at the end of the year if they're both under the threshold, but when you combine them, it's over the threshold. You need to make sure that we're combining those vendors to make sure we're reporting the full amount to each vendor so they get a 1099 if they meet that requirement. And if you're having an audit and you're a small company or organization, usually auditors will point out segregation of duties around payables, which is not always an easy thing to do if you're a small office. But whenever possible, you want to have at least 2 people involved in the process so that the same person isn't entering the bills, approving the bills, printing the checks, signing the checks. You want to split that up as much as possible. And also, if you're using debit and credit cards, who is reviewing that process to make sure that you don't have a person that's not with your organization end up with a credit card that's under your account, or an employee wasn't authorized to have a credit card, but somehow they ended up with one. We want to make sure that only certain employees that are authorized have those credit cards. And who is reviewing and approving the charges on those cards? Are the employees turning in receipts for every expense? And keeping on top of that every month, every billing cycle on your debit and credit cards. And also determining who does the review of the vendor list. Is it someone that's outside of the payables, so they might have a better viewpoint for catching duplicate vendors or vendors that you don't know anything about. So just trying to keep up to date and reviewing who's on your vendor list. You can usually get a vendor list out of your accounting system. And we have a number of clients that use bill.com, and you can get a list out of there. And even if you're maintaining it outside of your accounting system, to just review several times a year to make sure that it's not being populated with vendors you don't use or that you don't recognize. And then once you've done your vendor review, we need to look at what types of entities you're paying, because some need a 1099 and others don't, just based on what kind of entity they are. So 1099s are generally sent to individuals and sole proprietors. Sole proprietors usually have a doing business as name or a DBA name that might be on their invoices, or they might ask you to make checks payable to, but they're using their social security number for reporting purposes. So those individuals and sole proprietors will receive a 1099. Partnerships will also receive 1099s, and LLCs, where that's limited liability company. So a limited liability company may or may not receive a 1099. Now, if they're being taxed as a sole proprietor or a partnership, they should be receiving a 1099. And the C does not stand for corporation in an LLC. And who do you not send, who does not need a 1099, which are generally corporations and LLCs taxed as corporations, nonprofit organizations, and government entities. And there is an exception under corporations that if you're paying an attorney for legal services, or if you're paying a doctor or nurse or a clinic for medical or healthcare services, those two entities, the medical and the legal, even though they're a corporation, they will receive, or that you need to send them a 1099. So it's important to ask for the W-9 for any attorney or medical provider, because you're going to have that information in order to complete the 1099. The one thing on medical that is not covered under this would be prescriptions. So paying for prescriptions is not included as a medical service. And then once you've determined based on entity type who will need a 1099, then you also need to look at what types of payments have been made during the year. So we have a list here of reportable payments, and this is not all inclusive, it's just ones that we normally see. Compensation for personal and professional services, including accountants, attorneys, architects, the doctors and nurses, teachers, if you're paying any expert witnesses in any trials, those will need it to be reported. If you have an invoice that includes parts and materials as well as performing services, if the parts and materials are not specifically delineated on the invoice, they're not broken out, then you would include the full amount in the reportable payments. And then once that company or vendor receives their 1099, they will be breaking that out on their end when they file their tax returns. But if it's not broken out on the invoice, we report the full amount on the 1099. Copying services are reportable. Rental fees, if you're renting space or equipment, all kinds of rental fees are included on the 1099. Catering, if a caterer comes, they set up and they serve food, that's considered a service and the amount is reportable. Registration fees for conferences and training, those fees cover the presenters that are going to be presenting the information at those conferences, and that amount is reportable. Membership dues are reportable. This is usually around what the benefits are that you receive for the memberships. If you receive member-only events, you can attend and certain lectures or performances or whatever other activities might be part of that group that you're buying the membership from. Those amounts are reportable. If you are providing honorariums or speaker fees or paying for entertainment at your gala, all of those amounts are reportable. If you're buying merchandise that's custom made or has your logo on it, then those are reportable payments, as well as advertising, whether it's in a magazine or a brochure or on the radio or TV. Even display ads and billboards are considered reportable payments. Non-reportable payments would include anything that's under $600 total for the year for that vendor. So if they come in at $599, there's no reporting requirement. But anything 600 or more, that needs to be reported. Expense reimbursements to non-employees where they're turning in, so your independent contractors that are turning in receipts and getting reimbursements, those are not reportable. And related to employees, if you have an accountable plan and the employee is turning in receipts, those are not included on the W-2 either. So it all has to do with, are they documenting what they spent it on, and it had a business purpose for your organization. Insurance premiums are not reportable because you're buying that insurance coverage. Utility payments are also non-reportable. If you're buying merchandise where there's no service, there's no installation or training involved in that merchandise that you're buying, that's not reportable. Food and meals are not reportable, except as the catering that was under the reportable list. And then software, if you're buying software kind of off the shelf package and there's no renewal fee, there's no support, you don't get anything, you're just buying the software, then that is not a reportable payment. Sometimes software as a service can get a little more detailed, and looking into Google, if you have a Google Drive and you're paying for that storage in the cloud, what does your agreement say you're paying for? Because some of that under that agreement could be reportable if it's considered rent, or you're paying royalties for something. Those could fall under reportable payments. Software as a service is something that's evolving and is coming out with more scrutiny from the IRS as to what's reported or not. So if you have any of that kind of arrangement, then you need to gather more details on that. And in determining your type of vendor and in reviewing your vendor list, you want to know whether or not you have a completed W-9 for those vendors. The W-9 has not changed since October of 2018. So it's been around for a while in the same format with the same information. And it needs to be complete to be considered by the IRS as being authoritative. You need to have a signature on it from the person who's completing it. So they need to include their name, address, what type of entity they are. The entity type is in box 3, kind of in the middle of the form. And it has boxes that they check. Are they an individual, a C corporation, an S corp, a partnership? If they're a limited liability company, they check that box. But then to the side of that, they are to indicate whether they are a C corporation, an S, or a partnership. Sometimes we receive the W-9s and they'll check limited liability, but then they don't fill out that designation, in which case we assume that it's reportable and that they will need a will need a 1099 because that box is not completed to be able to rely on that. And then they should supply either a social security number or an employer identification number. Sometimes vendors will put both, especially the ones that have the sole proprietor or the DBA designation. They might put both numbers on there. If you're entering this in your accounting system, you would want to use the social security number. The IRS has said that if a vendor gives both numbers, the IRS would prefer that we use the social security numbers. And it is having a completed W-9 with a signature on it. If the IRS comes back saying that the information you have doesn't match their records, you can go back and point to this document and say, well, this is what was provided. That's what we relied on. They said it was true and accurate. And then you can usually avoid any IRS penalties by having that signed form on file when they tell you that it doesn't match their records. And when should you ask for or require a W-9? The best practice is to ask all of your vendors for a Form W-9, especially if you know that you're going to be paying them more than $600 for services during that calendar year. You will need a W-9 if you're putting your contractors in a payroll system. That system is going to require a W-9 in order to pay that person. They want that document. For a contractor is similar to a W-4 for an employee, that it's something that's required. If you know that during the year a vendor has moved or their name has changed, then you may ask, and you should follow up with getting an updated W-9 for them. You can ask for W-9s every year, require all vendors to submit new W-9s, but it's not required that you have those. But if you know something has happened, the company merged with another one, the name has changed, the address has changed, you would want to request a new W-9. And then you need to stay on top of, if you're not asking for those W-9s up front before you make a payment, and you've gone over $600 during the year, you need to keep on top of asking for those missing W-9s. One thing you don't want to do is get to the end of the year and find out that you have to ask 20 vendors for W-9s, and you need to track them down and get them all to turn in a W-9 so you can issue your 1099s in a timely manner and meet the deadline. In 2020, the IRS reinstituted the Form 1099 NEC. And they did this because they are trying to match the non-employee compensation that's reported on the 1099 with what individuals and contractors are reporting on their tax forms that they're filing. And they were finding that, the IRS was finding that they weren't getting the 1099 miscellaneous forms e-filed quick enough because the deadline for filing those is later. And they were getting people filing their tax returns and they didn't have a matching way to make sure that all income was reported. So they brought this 1099 NEC back into play. And the only thing that goes on the 1099 NEC that's reportable is non-employee compensation. That's what the NEC stands for. And this is where attorney fees are actually included as non-employee compensation on this form. So anything over $600 in non-employee compensation will be reported on the NEC. And you're going to include your organization name and tax ID number, as well as the vendor's name, address, tax ID number. If anyone is doing backup withholding or any sort of income tax withholding on these payments, you also need to include that on the NEC. But it is a straightforward form. When they came back with this NEC form, what happened was on the miscellaneous form, they moved the box 7 that had been on the miscellaneous form over to the NEC form. And its NEC is due to the independent contractor by January 31st, either by mail, or if you have them set up in a payroll system that provides it electronically, it needs to be accessible through the system by January 31st. And it also needs to be e-filed or mailed in to the IRS by January 31st. The IRS is lowering the threshold for requiring e-filing of these forms. It used to be 250 forms, it's down to 100 forms, and it's expected to continue to go down because the IRS wants as many forms to be e-filed as possible. And in 2022, the only change that they made to the form was they removed the year from this form. So it doesn't print on here as 2022 non-employee compensation. It reports as a fillable field on the form now. That way they don't have to come out with new forms every year. They're just going to use the same form and update it as needed. The 1099 miscellaneous form has been around for quite some time, And when they pulled box 7 off of the previous 2020 forms, what they did was rearrange and renumber the boxes on the form. In other respects, it's still the same with the organization's name and address and tax ID number, the recipient's information, and then the various boxes where you would report rent in box 1. If you have royalties, they're in box 2. Other income is where, medical and healthcare payments are in box 6. Other income in box 3 is for, there's some reportable, if you have scholarships or awards that get reported, would go in box 3. And again, if you're doing any income tax withholding, there are boxes on the form for both federal and state withholdings if you have any requirements there. So for the medical and healthcare payments in box 6, that's for every doctor or nurse that your hospital clinic that you're paying for those services. That falls under that corporation exception, that even though they might be incorporated, you're reporting that in box 6. These forms also need to be filed with the recipients by January 31st. But there is an extended deadline for e-filing with the IRS until the end of February. For SKC, when we're going through this process, we strive to get everything either mailed or e-filed by January 31st. And then, so we're filing these forms early, but we don't want to miss a deadline. So it's kind of our best practice to get those all filed by January 31st. As it relates to penalties and missing Social Security numbers or tax ID numbers, if you miss the January 31st deadline for getting it mailed to a vendor, or you miss the e-filing deadline of the January 31st or February 28th, and if you don't have reasonable cause, the IRS can assess a late penalty based on how late the form is. And that when you actually file it with the IRS is what date they will use for determining lateness. Right now, the penalties are $50 per form if you file within 30 days of the deadline. If you file after 30 days, but before August 1st, that penalty per form is $110. And if you file after August 1st, the penalty is $290 per form. We have not seen any IRS late payment notices for our clients, but that does not mean that the IRS won't start issuing those. They are allowed to issue those penalties. Since the IRS is trying to collect more and more money, they might be getting more strict on issuing those penalty notices. So if we miss a deadline or you don't have a tax ID number, so we're holding a form, we need to be able to show reasonable cause for why a form was filed late. Reasonable cause is not just that you couldn't get information. It has to be something that's out of your control. You had a fire in the building and you lost your records, or something was flooded, or something that's out of your control, not just that you ran out of time or a vendor didn't respond, which is why we try to stress vendor management throughout the year and not waiting until the last minute or the last quarter even to collect that information. On the B notice, if you forms filed with incorrect or missing tax ID numbers, you'll receive a B notice. And I know that a number of our clients have received these, and there are possible fines attached, but you have to read the notice to know the IRS is telling you information in the system doesn't match. and the remedy for fixing that. Sometimes you don't have to respond back to the IRS. You just go and verify your records. If it was a typo or transposition of numbers, they'll generally ask you to fix it for next time. If it's something that they want you to start backup withholding because you don't have a tax ID number for someone, but you need to inform that vendor, we need your number, we're going to have to start backup withholding. And then you need to actually withhold amounts from that vendor for any future payments. And then you need to report that back to the IRS that you're in compliance with their request. So it's important to read the notices and not just kind of scan through it, and because sometimes it can get a little buried as to what it is that you need to do. So how can we improve the process so that at year end we're not scrambling for W-9s? So reviewing a vendor list quarterly, you can even do it monthly. That way you're keeping on top of, you've paid someone $500 and you want to make sure the next quarter, did you go over 600? Do you need to request a W-9? Maybe you already have it in your system, and so you're good and you don't have to be concerned with that. Attaching a completed Form W-9 to the vendor record in the accounting system will keep the information all in one place, so that when you're running your vendor list, you can see right there in the system, you have that W-9. Some of our clients will use Bill.com, and you can store W-9s in Bill.com as well. And when it syncs into QuickBooks and brings in the tax ID number, but we know that which clients the W-9s are in Bill.com, and we can go out there and access those if a question comes up on the formatting of the number. Maybe it came in as a Social Security number and it should be a tax ID number. We can go into Bill.com and see that. And also, if we have that W-9 in QuickBooks, we can pull that W-9 up as well and look at that. If you receive B-Notices every year and you want to try and cut down on receiving those notices, the IRS has a taxpayer identification number matching program where you can send them a list of however many vendors with the numbers that you have and see if it matches what's in the IRS records. What the IRS will do is they will report back whether a number matches or not. They will not tell you what the correct number should be, but at least you can narrow down and investigate and follow up with those vendors where the IRS is saying it doesn't match their records. You can go online to irs.gov and sign up for that program, and it will give you instructions there on what information the IRS needs to set up an account for you. And one change that happened for the 2022 filing season that I don't have a slide for, but it relates to the 1099-Ks that credit card companies issue. When they came out with the rules a few years back, where if you're paying a vendor by credit card, the credit card company should be issuing the 1099 to that vendor, that you do not have to issue that. The IRS set the limits for that really high at $20,000 or 200 transactions. So a lot of the organizations we deal with, even though they paid a vendor by credit card, but they paid $1,500, and that vendor says they're not getting their 1099. It's because that threshold through the credit card companies was really high. For 2022, that's been lowered, and it's now anything above $600, regardless of how many transactions it was. So the credit card companies are going to be issuing a lot more 1099s this year than they have in the past few years. And your vendors should be seeing those 1099-Ks come to them in the mail. There is legislation out there that wants to lower, or no, wants to raise that threshold, maybe not to the $20,000 limit before, but maybe to $5,000. And that's going through various, the House and the Senate for approval on that related to the IRS perspective. So 2023 may change again, but for the 2022 1099s, credit card companies will be issuing those to your vendors. Now, also related to those 1099Ks, if you're paying something through PayPal and you've designated it as friends and family, they're not going to get a 1099. So we need to make sure that any payments through PayPal to your vendors are in there as business transactions. And that's also important for Zelle, Venmo, any of those companies. They're only picking up what is designated as a business transaction. And if you don't designate them that way, then you should be issuing 1099s outside of relying on the credit card companies to do that, because they're only picking up business transactions. Okay, and that is the end of my presentation. If anyone has any questions.